Sir, I need you to lower your voice.
Why?
Because my voice makes you uncomfortable. Because everyone here deserves to feel safe.
Safe?
Or just quiet enough for you.
I'm asking you calmly.
This doesn't have to escalate. Funny how the way speaks.
This isn't about who you are.
Then why am I the only one you're watching? Hey, she's just buying groceries. Leave her alone.
Mind your business.
It is their business when you harass people. So now the whole store's against me? This is your final warning. For words,
For harm.
harm.
Enough is enough.
Before you look away, what if the most painful moment of your life happened in a place so ordinary that no one expected it to matter? A grocery store? A line of strangers? A few careless words that cut deeper than fists ever could. In seconds, dignity is stripped away, fear floods the room, and silence becomes a weapon. This is how racism survives. Not always loud, not always violent, but sharp enough to wound, deep enough to scar, and common enough that we're tempted to look away. But what happens when someone doesn't? What happens when pain meets courage, when cruelty is confronted, and when ordinary people decide that enough is enough? This is not just a story about racism in America. It's a story about the moment everything could have gone wrong and didn't. A story about fear, humiliation, and the quiet strength it takes to stand up when your hands are shaking. A story that will hurt to watch and impossible to forget. Before you continue, subscribe to the Racist Reality channel, because these are stories that demand to be seen, felt, and shared. Stay with us and watch what happens when pain is exposed, truth is spoken, and humanity refuses to be silent. A normal day shattered, the automatic doors slid open and closed with their familiar, breath-like sigh, a sound so ordinary it barely registered. It was the sound of errands being finished, of lists being checked off, of lives moving forward in small, manageable steps. Inside the supermarket in Dayton, Ohio, the early evening unfolded with the soft choreography of routine. A mother nudged her cart forward with one hand while holding her toddler's fingers with the other. A teenage cashier scanned items and practiced rhythm, the beep of each barcode blending into the low hum of refrigeration units and distant chatter. Near the pharmacy, a line curved patiently along the wall, people shifting their weight, staring at their phones, waiting for names to be called. Nothing about the moment suggested danger. Nothing about it hinted at fear. And that, perhaps, is what made what followed so jarring. At first, the noise was indistinct. Raised voices happened in stores all the time. Someone is upset about a prescription delay, a billing issue, or a misunderstanding. Most conflicts dissolved as quickly as they flared, soothed by explanations or the quiet pressure of public scrutiny. But this voice did not soften. It cut. The sound carried across aisles with a sharpness that made conversation stall mid-sentence. Heads turned not out of curiosity but instinct. There is a particular pitch to a human voice when it crosses from frustration into hostility, and the body recognizes it before the mind catches up. Near the pharmacy counter, a man sat on a motorized scooter. Richard Collins, 47 years old, his posture rigid, his eyes alert in a way that had nothing to do with confusion or pain. His words landed with deliberate force, each one chosen not merely to be heard, but to dominate. Parents felt the shift first. A woman instinctively drew her child closer, her hand tightening around a small wrist. An elderly couple exchanged a glance that said more than words could. This doesn't feel right. Employees behind the counter froze, their training telling them to remain calm while their instincts told them to brace. Richard's voice rose again, louder now, echoing off tile and metal shelving. He wasn't speaking to any one person in particular. He was performing, staking a claim on the space, daring someone to challenge him. Some shoppers looked away, hoping invisibility might protect them. Others stared openly, anger and disbelief tangling in their expressions. A few reached for their phones, hesitated, then lowered them again, caught between documenting harm and avoiding it. No one intervened. That pause, the collective moment of waiting for someone else to act, is where ordinary days fracture. It is the space where fear is allowed to breathe. The store manager had already stepped away to make the call. When the doors opened again, the sound was the same as before, but this time everyone noticed. Officer Maya Johnson entered with a calm that was neither casual nor rigid, the practiced awareness of someone trained to read a room before stepping fully into it. At 29, she had learned that most encounters were decided in the first few moments, by tone, posture, restraint. Her body camera blinked red. Recording. She took in the scene quickly. The children, the line at the pharmacy, the man on the scooter whose voice had already rewritten the mood of the room. She did not rush toward him. She did not raise her voice. Her hands remained visible, her stance open. "Sir," she said evenly, "can I talk to you for a moment?" Richard turned his head slowly, deliberately. His gaze swept over her uniform, her face lingering in a way that felt less like recognition and more like assessment. "About time," he snapped. "I'm just trying to get my medication. I serve this country, you know." Maya nodded once. "I hear you, and I appreciate your service. Let's step over here so we can talk without blocking the counter." "No," he replied immediately, too quickly. "I'm fine right here." The word "fine" hung awkwardly in the air, out of place amid the tension he had created. Maya didn't argue. She knew better. Arguing turns friction into flame. "Okay," she said. "Help me understand what's going on." Richard launched into a tangled explanation. His leg, his pain, his frustration, the way people disrespected him, the way the world had changed. His voice swelled and dipped as he spoke, swinging between grievance and accusation. He gestured broadly, drawing attention, pulling the room tighter around him. Maya listened. She listened as he spoke about his medical issues, about the injury that made standing difficult. She acknowledged his discomfort. She thanked him again for his service. She offered choices: finish the transaction calmly or step outside and talk things through. An off-ramp, a way out that preserved dignity. Richard did not take it. Instead, his tone sharpened. His words became barbed, aimed not just at her, but at the invisible lines that divided the room. "You people always do this," he sneered, loud enough for others to hear, "always trying to push folks around." The phrase landed heavily, its meaning clear without being explicit. Maya felt the shift immediately, the subtle tightening in her chest, the way the air seemed to grow heavier. She straightened slightly, her voice still controlled. "Sir, I need you to lower your voice. There are children here." Richard laughed. It wasn't nervous laughter. It wasn't the laugh of embarrassment or deflection. It was mocking. That laugh did something to the room. It stripped away any lingering doubt that this was a misunderstanding. It told everyone within earshot that he knew exactly what he was doing and did not care. Maya felt the weight of the moment settle on her shoulders, familiar and exhausting. A black woman in uniform standing in a space where anger had already chosen its target. She could feel eyes on her, some hopeful, some wary, some already writing the story they expected to see. She thought of the training videos, the policy manuals, the unspoken rules about professionalism and restraint. She thought of how often patience was mistaken for weakness, how often composure was demanded only from those already carrying the heaviest load. Around them, the ordinary life of the store hovered uncertainly, waiting to see what would happen next. The cashier's scanner sat silent. A child asked a parent a question in a whisper that sounded too loud. Time stretched thin. This was no longer just about a prescription. It was about whether hate would be allowed to occupy the space unchecked, about whether fear would be permitted to spread simply because it arrived loudly. And beneath it all was a quieter truth, one that pressed against the moment with painful clarity. Public safety is not just about laws or uniforms. It is about the willingness to draw a line, not with anger, but with resolve, when someone decides that their voice matters more than everyone else's right to feel safe. The ordinary day had already been broken. What remained was the test of what kind of society would respond. The weight of patience. Patience is often praised as a virtue, but rarely is it acknowledged as a burden. For Officer Maya Johnson, patience had never been passive. It was active, deliberate, something she carried the way others carried equipment, heavy and necessary. It lived in her shoulders, in the careful cadence of her voice, in the way she learned to pause before responding, even when every nerve urged her to react. She stood a few feet from Richard Collins. The space between them measured not only in steps, but in histories that neither of them could fully see, and yet both of them felt. Maya could sense the room watching her, not staring exactly. Watching. The difference mattered. Watching meant waiting for something to go wrong, bracing for impact, deciding in advance where blame might land. Watching meant that whatever she did next would not belong to her alone. It would be interpreted, replayed, judged. She had learned that early in her career, how the same action could be described as calm when performed by one officer and cold when performed by another. How the margin for error shrank when your skin marked you before your words ever could. Richard continued talking, his voice climbing and dipping unpredictably. He spoke about pain, real pain, the kind that changes a person's relationship with their own body. He spoke about being ignored, about feeling invisible, about how people no longer respected him the way they used to. Maya listened because she had to, because listening was her job, because listening was also the only tool she had left that might diffuse what was tightening like a knot. "I just want what I'm owed," Richard said, pounding his hand against the armrest of his scooter. "I shouldn't have to beg." "I understand you're frustrated," Maya replied. She chose each word carefully, the way one chooses footing on ice. "But yelling isn't going to make this easier for anyone." "Easy?" he snapped. "You think my life's been easy?" The question was rhetorical, but it landed with an edge that made it feel like a challenge. Maya didn't answer right away. She knew better than to make the moment about comparison. Pain, she had learned, was not a competition, and yet, in spaces like this, it was always framed as one. She nodded instead. "No," she said quietly. "I don't." Something flickered across Richard's face then. Surprise, perhaps, or confusion. It passed quickly, replaced by irritation. "You don't know anything about me," he said. "You're just here to push me around like everyone else." Maya felt the familiar tightening in her chest. The accusation was not new, but it never lost its sting. She had sworn an oath to serve, to protect, to keep the peace. And yet again and again, she found herself cast as an oppressor before she had done anything at all. "I'm here to make sure everyone stays safe," she replied, "including you." Richard scoffed. "Safe from what? From me?" The way he said it, half mocking, half daring, made several people nearby shift uncomfortably. A mother near the end of the pharmacy line glanced toward the exit, calculating distances. A store employee hovered behind the counter, unsure whether to step in or step back. Maya noticed it all. She always did. Safety was not an abstract concept to her. It was the child gripping a parent's coat. It was the elderly man leaning more heavily on his cane. It was the collective tension that made a public space feel suddenly fragile. "Yes," Maya said evenly, "from things escalating." Richard laughed again, louder this time. "Escalating? I'm not the one with a gun." The words landed hard, ricocheting through the room. Maya felt the weight of her badge, her uniform, her training, all of it suddenly reframed by a single sentence. She was used to it, and yet she wasn't. No amount of experience fully prepares you for the moment when your presence alone is turned into a provocation. She resisted the urge to respond defensively. She knew that was what he wanted, to pull her off balance, to turn the encounter into a spectacle. Instead, she took a breath. "Sir," she said, her voice lower now, firmer, "I need you to stop raising your voice and making comments that are upsetting people around you." Richard's eyes darted briefly toward the onlookers, then back to her. He saw them now, really saw them, the discomfort, the fear, and something in that recognition hardened him rather than softened him. "They're just too sensitive," he said. "This country's gone soft." The phrase carried more than it said. It always did. Maya heard in it the echoes of other encounters, other complaints, other moments when frustration curdled into something uglier. She felt tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep fixes, but the kind that settles into the bones. The fatigue of being asked again and again to absorb hostility with grace, of being told implicitly that her professionalism would be measured not by her competence, but by her ability to endure disrespect without reacting. She thought of her father, who had taught her how to drive in an empty parking lot, his voice calm even when she stalled the engine again and again. Control is strength, he had told her, not silence. Control. "Mr. Collins," she said, using his name deliberately, "you're making people uncomfortable. I need you to cooperate so we can resolve this." Hearing his name seemed to irritate him further. Don't talk down to me. I'm not, Maya replied. I'm trying to help. There it was, the line she walked every day. Help offered, mistrust received, authority questioned, restraint demanded. For a moment, the room felt suspended, as if everyone were holding the same breath. This was the hinge point, the place where encounters tipped one way or another. Maya knew it. Richard knew it too, though perhaps not consciously. She saw the decision forming in his posture, in the way his shoulders squared, in the faint curl of his lip. Some people escalate because they feel powerless. Others escalate because they want to reclaim power they believe is slipping away. Richard's next words were chosen to wound. You people always stick together, he said, his voice dripping with contempt. Covering for each other, thinking you run everything now. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. There was no ambiguity left in the statement, no room for charitable interpretation. It was a line drawn not just against Maya, but against an entire group of people, present and absent, named and unnamed. Maya felt it land not just on her, but on everyone who looked like her, on her mother, on her younger brother, on every black officer who had ever been told to prove they belonged in a uniform that demanded allegiance, but did not always offer protection in return. She swallowed. The policy manual did not prepare her for this part. There was no checkbox for how to respond when your humanity is reduced to a stereotype in front of strangers. No training scenario that fully captured the quiet humiliation of being targeted not for what you've done, but for who you are. Still, she stood her ground. That kind of language isn't acceptable, she said. I need you to stop. Richard leaned back slightly, a smirk tugging at his mouth. Or what? The question was small, almost casual, but it carried the weight of a dare. Maya felt the eyes on her again, sharper now. This was the moment that would be replayed, analyzed, and slowed down. The moment where restraint could be praised or condemned, depending on who told the story. She thought of why she had joined the force in the first place. Not for power, not for authority, but because she believed, still believed, that public spaces should belong to everyone, that safety was a shared right, not a privilege granted conditionally. She took another breath, steadying herself. Or I'll have to take further action, she said calmly, and I don't want to do that. The words were measured and professional, but beneath them lay something raw and deeply human, a plea for the situation to end without anyone being hurt, physically or otherwise. Richard stared at her, weighing his options. The room waited with him. Patience, Maya knew, was not endless. It was a bridge, not a destination, and bridges, no matter how carefully built, could only hold so much weight before they began to crack. The question now was not whether pain existed in this space. It clearly did. The question was whether it would be allowed to spread. When words become weapons, words are often dismissed as harmless, mere sounds, fleeting expressions of feeling. But anyone who has stood on the receiving end of hatred knows better. Words can bruise, they can corner, they can turn public spaces into battlegrounds without a single fist being raised. In the pharmacy aisle of that Dayton supermarket, words had already crossed that threshold. Richard Collins did not raise his voice this time. He didn't need to. The smirk that lingered on his face said enough. It was the look of someone who believed he had seized control, not through reason or volume, but through provocation, through the knowledge that he had found a place where it hurt. Officer Maya Johnson stood still, her posture composed, her expression neutral in the way she had learned to perfect. But inside her, something trembled, not fear, not anger, something more complicated, the ache of being reduced, again, to a symbol instead of a person. Around them, the air felt thick, as though the store itself were holding its breath. The ordinary noises, the hum of refrigerators, the distant beep of a checkout scanner, felt intrusive now, reminders that life was continuing even as something fragile threatened to break. Richard spoke again, his voice quieter but sharper. You gonna arrest me for talking now? Maya met his gaze. She had learned not to look away, not to stare him down either. Balance mattered. Everything mattered. No, she said, I'm asking you to stop harassing people. I'm the one being harassed, he shot back. I'm the one everyone's staring at. The irony would have been almost laughable if it weren't so painful. He gestured broadly, as if to prove his point, his hands sweeping toward the onlookers who quickly averted their eyes. He saw himself as the center of the storm, not its source. Maya glanced briefly around the store. She saw the truth of the moment written on people's faces, the discomfort, the fear, the quiet calculation of whether to stay or leave, whether to speak or remain silent. She saw something else too, the subtle way some people leaned toward her, as if proximity alone might offer protection, the unspoken trust placed in her uniform, even as others questioned her right to wear it. "Sir," she said, her voice steady, "no one here is targeting you, but your words are affecting others." Richard snorted. "That's their problem." There it was, the philosophy laid bare, a belief that personal grievance justified public harm, that discomfort inflicted on others was acceptable so long as it served one's own sense of grievance. Maya felt a wave of sadness wash over her, unexpected and heavy, not just for herself but for the man in front of her, for the way pain, left unexamined, could curdle into cruelty. How easily hurt could turn into a weapon when no one intervened early enough. "You don't get to decide that," she said quietly. "We all share this space." Richard leaned forward slightly on his scooter, his eyes narrowing. "Funny how sharing only matters when it's people like you saying it." The words landed like a slap. This time, there was no murmured uncertainty in the room. No one pretended not to understand what he meant. The line had been crossed openly, deliberately. A few gasps escaped before people could stop themselves. A woman near the pharmacy counter shook her head slowly, disbelief etched across her face. Maya felt the heat rise in her cheeks, a physical reaction she could not entirely suppress. She had been called many things in her life. She had learned to endure. But there was something uniquely painful about being stripped of individuality in a moment when she was trying, so carefully, to protect everyone present. "That's enough," she said, her tone firmer now. Richard smiled as if pleased. "There it is. I knew it wouldn't take long." His satisfaction was unmistakable. He had wanted this shift, this tightening of her voice, to prove something to himself, perhaps more than anyone else. That authority was a mask, that civility was fragile, that he could still provoke a reaction. Maya took another breath, deeper this time. She reminded herself that firmness was not failure, boundaries were not aggression, that stopping harm did not require an apology. "I'm giving you a lawful order," she said. "Stop making discriminatory remarks and lower your voice." The phrase lawful order changed the temperature of the room. It signaled escalation, yes, but also clarity. This was no longer a misunderstanding. It was a matter of conduct. Richard's smile faded. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across his face. He had expected outrage, perhaps even force. He had not expected calm authority. "You can't tell me what to think," he muttered. "I'm not," Maya replied. "I'm telling you how to behave in a public space." Silence stretched again, taut and uneasy. Somewhere in the store, a child began to cry, softly at first, then louder, the sound cutting through the tension like a blade. The child's distress seemed to jolt something loose in the room, a reminder of who was truly vulnerable here. Maya glanced toward the sound, then back to Richard. "There are children here," she said. "They don't need to hear this." For a brief moment, just a moment, Richard hesitated. His eyes flicked toward the crying child, then away. Something unreadable passed over his face. Guilt, shame, or simply annoyance at the interruption? Then his jaw tightened. "Everyone's always blaming me," he said, his voice rising again. "I say what I want, and suddenly I'm the bad guy." The statement was almost plaintive now, wrapped in defensiveness rather than bravado. Maya recognized it, the instinct to cast oneself as the victim rather than confront the harm one causes. It was easier that way, less painful. "No one's blaming you for feeling frustrated," she said, "but you are responsible for how you treat others." Richard shook his head. "You don't get it." Maya wanted to say that she did, that she understood more than he could imagine, about being judged, about being unheard, about carrying anger that had nowhere safe to go. But she knew better than to make the moment about shared suffering. Pain did not excuse harm. It explained it, perhaps, but explanation was not absolution. This doesn't have to end badly, she said instead. You can choose to stop. The choice hung between them, fragile and fleeting. The room seemed to lean in, collectively willing him to take it. But pride is a powerful force. Richard exhaled sharply, his expression hardening once more. I'm not backing down, he said. You people always want to silence me. The words echoed, heavy with accusation and resentment. Maya felt the last threads of patience strain. Not snap, she would not allow that, but stretch thin enough to ache. She thought of all the times she had been told to be patient, to endure, to understand, to absorb, and she wondered, not for the first time, who patience was really for, who benefited from her restraint, and who paid its cost. Around them, the ordinary world waited, uncertain and exposed. This confrontation was no longer just about one man's anger or one officer's composure. It was about what a community would tolerate, about whether cruelty would be allowed to masquerade as free expression, about whether silence would be mistaken for peace. Maya straightened, her decision settling into place with quiet resolve. Sir, she said, this is your final warning. The words were clear, unavoidable, and with them came the realization that sometimes, when words are used as weapons, stopping the harm requires more than listening. It requires the courage to draw a line, not out of hatred, but out of care for everyone who shares the space. The room held its breath once more. What came next would test not only authority, but humanity itself. The line is drawn. There is a moment in every conflict when silence stops being neutral. It is the moment when the absence of action becomes its own kind of choice, one that quietly sides with harm simply by allowing it to continue. In the pharmacy aisle, that moment arrived not with a shout, but with a stillness so complete it felt almost reverent. Officer Maya Johnson stood with her feet planted, her shoulders squared, not in defiance but in resolve. She had reached the end of what patience alone could hold, not because she lacked empathy, but because empathy without boundaries becomes surrender. Sir, she said, her voice steady and unmistakably clear, this is your final warning. Richard Collins stared at her, searching her face for doubt. He found none. The room reacted before he did. A ripple of movement passed through the onlookers. Small shifts of weight, nervous glances exchanged. A woman quietly guiding her child farther back. Everyone understood now. The encounter had crossed into a new phase. Whatever happened next would not be easily undone. Richard scoffed, but the sound lacked its earlier confidence. You're serious, he said, as if the realization surprised him. Yes, Maya replied. I am. For a brief second, something like fear flickered in his eyes. It vanished quickly, buried beneath indignation. He had spent too long performing outrage to retreat gracefully now. You're proving my point, he said loudly, turning his head so others could hear. This is what they do. Silence anyone who doesn't think like them. A murmur spread through the crowd, uneasy, conflicted. Some people looked at Maya, others at Richard, trying to reconcile the narrative he was offering with the reality unfolding in front of them. Maya did not raise her voice. She did not interrupt. She waited until the murmurs faded. No one is silencing you, she said. You're being asked to stop harassing others. Those are not the same thing. Richard opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, something unexpected happened. A voice came from behind the pharmacy counter. That's true. It was quiet but firm. The cashier, a woman in her early 30s, her name tag reading Emily, stepped slightly forward. Her hands trembled, though her voice did not. We've asked you multiple times to calm down, she said, addressing Richard directly. You're scaring people. The room shifted again. Emily's words landed with a different weight, not authority but courage. She was not trained for this. She had not signed up to mediate conflict or confront hatred. She had simply reached a point where silence felt heavier than fear. Richard turned toward her, surprise flashing across his face. Stay out of it, he snapped. This doesn't concern you. It does, Emily replied, swallowing hard. This is my workplace. Her simple statement carried a quiet power, a reminder that public spaces are built not just on rules, but on the people who inhabit them, who deserve to feel safe within them. Another voice joined in. this one older, steadier. "She's right," said a man near the end of the aisle. He stepped forward slightly, his cane tapping softly against the tile. "You don't get to talk to people like that." Richard looked around, his eyes darting from face to face. He had expected isolation, perhaps confrontation, but not this. Not resistance from ordinary people who had, until now, remained quiet. "You're all ganging up on me," he said, his voice rising again. "See? This is exactly what I'm talking about." Maya felt a strange mixture of relief and sorrow. Relief that the burden was no longer hers alone. Sorrow that it had taken so much to get here. "No one is ganging up on you," she said gently. "They're setting boundaries." The word boundaries seemed to anger him more than anything else. Perhaps because boundaries implied limits. Limits he did not want to acknowledge. "This country used to be different," he muttered. "People weren't so damn sensitive." A woman holding her son's hand spoke up then, her voice shaking with restrained emotion. "My child shouldn't have to hear hate when we're just trying to buy medicine," she said. "That's not sensitivity. That's decency." Her words cut through the tension with quiet precision. Richard faltered, his mouth opening and closing, as if searching for a retort that wouldn't come. Maya felt the moment crystallize. This was no longer just about enforcement. It was about community, about the collective decision to say enough. "Sir," she said once more, "I'm asking you to leave the store." The request was clear, lawful, and measured. It offered one last path that preserved dignity, an exit without escalation. Richard's hands clenched on the armrests of his scooter. For a heartbeat, it seemed as though he might comply, that the weight of the room's disapproval, the voices of strangers, had finally reached him. Then his pride surged back. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "You'll have to make me." The words hung in the air, heavy with consequence. Maya nodded slowly, acknowledging the choice he had made, not agreeing with it, acknowledging it. "Okay," she said, "then we're going to proceed." She moved with deliberate calm, her actions precise and by the book. She explained what she was doing and why, her voice steady even as her heart pounded. She knew how this would look, how it might be framed by those who saw only fragments, only outcomes. But she also knew this. Allowing harm to continue would be a failure of her duty, not just to policy, but to people. As she secured the situation, the room remained silent, watching closely. There was no cheering, no triumph, only a shared understanding that something painful but necessary was unfolding. Richard protested loudly now, his words tumbling over one another, accusations, grievances, fragments of anger. But they lacked the sharpness they once had. The audience he had been playing to no longer accepted the performance. When it was over, when the tension finally began to ease, a collective exhale moved through the store. People looked at one another with a mixture of exhaustion and quiet relief. Maya stood still for a moment, grounding herself. She felt the familiar aftershock, the emotional residue of confrontation, the questions that would come later, the scrutiny, the endless replaying of every word and gesture. Emily met her eyes from behind the counter, gratitude plain on her face. The mother with the child offered a small, weary smile. The man with the cane nodded once, firmly. None of it erased the hurt that had been spoken. None of it made the moment painless. But it mattered. Because for once, the weight of confronting hatred had not rested on one person alone. Because a line had been drawn, not in anger, but in defense of shared humanity. And in that ordinary supermarket, something quietly profound had happened. People had chosen not just to witness history's old wounds reopening, but to refuse to let them define the present. The day would not return to normal. Not entirely. Some scars lingered, but the space felt different now, lighter, steadier, as if the community, bruised but unbroken, had taken a collective step toward becoming what it claimed to be. The aftermath after confrontation, there is always a silence that feels different from the one before. It is not tense in the same way. It does not brace for impact. Instead, it settles, unevenly, cautiously, like dust after something heavy has fallen. In the supermarket, that silence moved slowly through the aisles, lingering in corners, clinging to the edges of ordinary life that was trying, uncertainly, to resume. The pharmacy scanner beeped again. Someone cleared their throat. A cart rolled forward with a soft squeak of rubber against tile. Life continued, because it had to, but it did not do so untouched. Officer Maya Johnson stood near the entrance now, her hands resting loosely at her sides. The adrenaline that had carried her through the encounter was beginning to ebb, leaving behind the familiar ache that followed moments like these. It was an ache she knew well, part exhaustion, part grief, part quiet anger that had nowhere appropriate to go. She checked in briefly with the store manager, her voice professional, measured. Procedures were discussed. Reports would be written. Statements might be requested. The machinery of accountability was already turning, slow and inexorable. But beneath the formalities lay something far less structured, the emotional aftermath. Maya felt it in the way her shoulders sagged slightly once no one was shouting, in the heaviness behind her eyes, in the small, involuntary tremor that ran through her fingers when she finally allowed herself to notice it. She had done her job. She knew that. And still, the cost lingered. Across the store, Emily leaned against the counter, her knees weak now that the moment had passed. She hadn't realized how tightly she'd been holding herself together until it was no longer necessary. Her manager placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, murmuring something she couldn't quite hear. "You okay?" he asked. Emily nodded, though tears pricked at the corners of her eyes. "Yeah," she said. "I think so." It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. She kept replaying the moment she'd spoken up, the way her voice had sounded louder in her own ears than she'd expected, the fear that had surged through her when Richard turned toward her, anger flashing in his eyes. She had never imagined herself as someone who confronted strangers. She had always thought of courage as something other people possessed, and yet there she had been. She glanced toward Maya, who stood a short distance away, her posture composed but weary. Emily felt a swell of gratitude so strong it surprised her. Gratitude and something else, admiration perhaps, or the dawning realization of how much was asked of people like Maya, every day, often without thanks. Near the pharmacy line, the mother knelt in front of her son, smoothing his hair back gently. "It's okay," she whispered. "It's over." The boy nodded, though his brow remained furrowed. "Why was he so mad?" he asked. The question landed heavily. Children have a way of asking what adults struggle to answer. The mother hesitated, searching for words that would not burden him with the full weight of the truth. "Sometimes," she said slowly, "people carry a lot of hurt inside them, and instead of asking for help, they let that hurt come out in ways that hurt others." "Is that okay?" he asked. "No," she said softly. "It's not." She held his gaze, wanting him to understand this much at least. That pain explained behavior, but it did not excuse it. That kindness mattered. That speaking up mattered. Nearby, the older man with the cane lingered longer than he needed to, his prescription already in hand. He watched as people slowly returned to their routines, as if committing the moment to memory. He had lived long enough to recognize patterns, to see how easily moments like this were dismissed once the immediate disruption passed, how quickly discomfort faded into anecdote, into rumor, into nothing at all. He approached Maya cautiously, waiting until she looked his way. "You handled that well," he said simply. Maya met his eyes, surprised by the lump that rose suddenly in her throat. Praise was not why she did the job. Still, it mattered more than she liked to admit. "Thank you," she replied. He nodded once firmly. "I've seen things like this go very differently," he added. "Today, people did the right thing." Maya absorbed his words, letting them settle. They did not erase the ugliness of what had been said. They did not undo the hurt. But they offered something else. Affirmation that the effort to hold the line had not been invisible. When he left, the store felt a little quieter. Not empty, just calmer. Maya stepped outside briefly, the cool evening air brushing against her face. She closed her eyes for a moment, grounding herself in the simple reality of breath. In and out, here and now. This part, the decompression, was never in the training videos. The manuals did not address the emotional residue of being targeted, of standing between harm and the people it might consume. There was no checklist for processing the knowledge that someone had looked at her and seen not an individual, but a threat shaped by prejudice. She thought of her mother, who would likely hear about the incident later, through a call, or worse, through a headline stripped of context. She thought of the careful conversations they had shared over the years about safety, about visibility, about the double consciousness required to navigate spaces where one's presence was always politicized. Inside the store, the manager made a brief announcement thanking customers for their patience. It was mundane, almost awkward, and yet it marked a turning point, a formal acknowledgement that something had happened, that it mattered. Emily returned to her register, her hands steadier now. A customer smiled at her as she scanned their items. "You did well," the woman said quietly. Emily swallowed. "Thank you." The words felt like a balm. As the evening wore on, the story of what had happened began to change shape, as stories always do. Some would remember the anger most vividly. Others would focus on the intervention, the courage, the relief. A few might forget it entirely by morning. But for those who had been there, who had felt the tension in their bodies, who had weighed the risk of speaking against the cost of silence, the moment would linger. Because the aftermath is not just about what follows an event, it is about what remains. For Maya, what remained was a renewed clarity about why she stayed in a job that demanded so much and offered so little protection in return. Not because she believed herself to be a savior, not because she thought one intervention could undo centuries of harm, but because moments like this, fragile, imperfect, human, were where the abstract ideals of justice met real lives. For Emily, what remained was the knowledge that her voice mattered, that she did not need authority or a uniform to draw a boundary. That fear did not disqualify courage, it accompanied it. For the child, what remained was a lesson still forming, that the world could be frightening, but also that people could step in, that adults could say no to cruelty, that safety was something worth protecting together. The store would close later that night. Lights would dim, floors would be cleaned, the space would reset, ready to welcome another ordinary day. But the people would carry the aftermath with them, in small ways, in quiet reflections, in choices yet to be made. And in that carrying lay the true measure of the moment. Because confronting racism is never only about stopping one act or one person, it is about what we do next, about whether we allow ourselves to feel the pain honestly, learn from it deeply, and choose again and again to build something better from its wake. The stories we carry, every incident ends, but its meaning does not. Long after the patrol car doors close and the fluorescent lights hum back into normalcy, the real work begins, not in courtrooms or reports, but in memory. In the quiet places where people sort through what they saw, what they felt, and what it says about the country they are trying to belong to. For Officer Maya Johnson, the drive back to the station was routine in all the ways that mattered, and heavy in all the ways that didn't. Traffic lights blinked from red to green, the radio crackled with dispatch updates, her hands rested steady on the wheel. Anyone watching from outside would have seen nothing unusual. Inside, the echoes lingered. She thought about the words thrown at her, not their shock value, which had long since dulled, but their familiarity. They were old words, dusted off and reused, like tools inherited from a past that refused to stay buried. Words that did not require creativity, only permission. Words that thrived on the assumption that silence would follow. Maya had learned early in her career that these moments were cumulative. No single encounter defined her, but together they formed a ledger, an invisible accounting of emotional labor rarely acknowledged. Each incident asked the same quiet question: how much can you absorb and still show up tomorrow? She remembered her first year on the force, when a senior officer, kind, tired, and well-meaning, had told her, "You'll get used to it." She had nodded then, because that was what rookies did. Now, years later, she understood the flaw in that advice. You didn't get used to it. You learned how to carry it. You learned how to place the weight carefully so it didn't crush everything else. At home that night, Maya kicked off her boots and sat in the dark for a long moment before turning on the lights. Her phone buzzed with a message from her sister. "You okay?" Maya typed, erased, and finally settled on, "Yeah, long day." It was true, and incomplete. Across town, Emily lay awake in bed, the ceiling fan casting slow shadows above her. She replayed the scene again and again, each time noticing something new. The way her heart had raced, the way her voice had wavered before it steadied, the way the officer had met her eyes, not with irritation, but with recognition. Emily had grown up believing that racism was something loud and obvious, something confined to history books and viral videos. She hadn't understood how it could erupt in the most ordinary spaces, how it could turn a pharmacy line into a battleground. She wondered how many times something like this had happened without her noticing. How often had she been spared the discomfort of awareness simply because she hadn't been the target? That realization hurt, but it also clarified something. She thought about her parents, who had taught her to be polite, to keep her head down, to avoid conflict whenever possible. They had meant well, but tonight had shown her that politeness, unchecked, could become a shield for cruelty. Courage, she realized, wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was the choice to interrupt a moment that everyone else hoped would pass quickly. At breakfast the next morning, the story surfaced again, this time through the gentle curiosity of a child. The boy from the store sat at the table, cereal untouched, his mind elsewhere. "Mom?" he asked. "Yes? Is that man bad?" She paused, remembering her own mother's words from years ago, words she had not fully understood at the time. "I don't think he's bad," she said carefully. "I think he made bad choices." "Why?" "Because he was hurting," she said, "and because sometimes people don't know how to ask for help." The boy frowned. "But he hurt other people." "Yes," she said, "and that's why it had to stop." She reached for his hand. "The important thing is what we do when we see someone being hurt." He nodded slowly, absorbing this. Children learn not from perfection, but from honesty. Later that day, the older man with the cane told the story to a neighbor over coffee. He described the anger, the intervention, and the calm professionalism of the officer. But he lingered longest on the moment when the shouting stopped, not because of force, but because someone finally said, "Enough." "I've lived through worse times," he said, "but that doesn't mean we stop paying attention." His neighbor listened, thoughtful. "Do you think things are better now?" she asked. He smiled sadly. "I think things are clearer. That means the work is harder, but also more honest." This is how stories travel, not in headlines alone, but in kitchens and cars and quiet conversations where people test their understanding of the world against what they have witnessed. At the station, Maya filed her report with precision. Facts, timelines, actions taken. There was no place in the document for the way her stomach had tightened when the insults began. No checkbox for the calculus of restraint. No field for dignity maintained under pressure. But later in the locker room, another officer, newer, younger, approached her hesitantly. "I heard what happened," he said. "You handled it really well." Maya studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Thanks." He shifted his weight. "Does it ever get easier?" She considered the question, recognizing the vulnerability beneath it. "No," she said honestly, "but you get stronger, and you learn who you can lean on." He absorbed this, grateful for the truth. What bound all of these people together, the officer, the cashier, the child, the bystanders, was not trauma alone. It was the shared responsibility of meaning-making, the understanding that moments of harm do not disappear when they end. They either harden us or teach us. Racism survives on repetition and silence. It feeds on the idea that nothing will change, that intervention is futile, that kindness is naive. But what it cannot withstand is sustained attention, the kind that refuses to look away, that insists on naming harm without surrendering to hatred. In the days that followed, none of the people involved became heroes in the cinematic sense. There were no speeches, no viral accolades. Life resumed its ordinary rhythm, and yet something subtle had shifted. Emily found herself speaking up more often, even when her voice shook. Maya found herself mentoring younger officers with renewed intention, reminding them that authority without humanity was hollow. A child learned that fairness was not abstract, but practiced. A community absorbed the lesson that public spaces belong to everyone, or they belong to no one at all. These are the stories we carry. They do not always announce themselves. They live in our posture, our choices, and our willingness to intervene. They shape the America we wake up to each morning. Not the America of slogans or symbols, but the America of small, decisive moments, where love contends with fear, where dignity stands against degradation, and where ordinary people decide quietly and bravely that cruelty will not have the final word. The line that holds every society draws lines. Some are painted on roads. Some are etched into law books. Others exist only because people agree, again and again, not to cross them. When those lines are tested, the test is never abstract. It happens in real places, with real people, under fluorescent lights and watchful cameras, where the consequences are immediate and human. In the days after the incident, the story narrowed, as it always does, into questions of legality. What charge applied? What standard had been met? What would happen next? These questions mattered. They mattered not because punishment alone could heal harm, but because lines without consequence dissolve into suggestions, and suggestions are no match for cruelty. At the county courthouse, the process began quietly. Paperwork moved from one desk to another. A docket number appeared where a man's name once carried authority in his own mind. Disorderly conduct. A battery on a law enforcement officer. Words that sounded clinical, insufficient, and yet heavy with implication. Officer Maya Johnson reviewed the case file with a steady professionalism honed by repetition. She had learned to separate the personal from the procedural, not to erase emotion, but to ensure it did not distort the work. Justice, she knew, required clarity more than catharsis. Still, there were moments when the weight pressed in. She thought about how easily the incident could be misread if stripped of context. How often people who were not there asked why officers didn't simply walk away. Why weren't words ignored? Why wasn't it infinite? They did not understand that tolerance without boundaries is not a virtue, it is abandonment. The law exists not to silence disagreement, but to protect safety. Not to punish speech, but to restrain conduct when it becomes a weapon. The line had not been crossed when insults were hurled alone, ugly as they were, but when spit left a mouth and struck a face. When degradation became physical. When contempt turned into assault. That distinction mattered. In a small conference room, a prosecutor explained it plainly to a junior colleague. Free speech ends where harm begins, she said, and harm doesn't have to leave a bruise. Outside the courthouse, conversations unfolded in quieter places. Emily met her friend Sarah for coffee, the warmth of the cup grounding her as she recounted what had happened. She noticed how Sarah's expression shifted, from disbelief to anger to something softer, more unsettled. I always thought I'd know what to do, Sarah admitted, but I don't know if I would have said anything. Emily nodded. I didn't either. Not until I did. That was the truth of it. Courage did not arrive as certainty. It arrived as discomfort, as the refusal to let fear make the decision. What scares me, Sarah said, lowering her voice, is how normal it felt. Like it could happen anywhere. That's why it matters that it stopped, Emily replied. Not perfectly, but publicly. They sat with that for a moment, the hum of the cafe filling the space between them. Elsewhere, the older man with the cane watched the evening news, his jaw tightening as a familiar phrase scrolled across the screen. Police encounter sparks debate. He muted the television. Debate, he thought, was a luxury afforded to those untouched by the immediate harm. For him, the issue was not whether lines should exist, but whether they would be enforced with fairness and restraint. He remembered other times, other lines drawn too late or not at all. He remembered what happened when silence was mistaken for peace. What struck him most about this case was not the cruelty of one man, but the collective response that followed. The willingness of ordinary people to say, this is not acceptable here. The restraint of an officer who could have escalated, but did not. The clarity of consequences applied without spectacle. This was not perfection. It was progress measured in inches. For Maya, the legal process brought its own complexities. She prepared herself to testify if needed, knowing that her composure would be scrutinized as much as the facts. She had learned that professionalism was often demanded most from those least protected by assumption. She also knew something else. Accountability ran both ways. Body cameras existed not to shield officers from criticism, but to anchor truth. In this case, the footage spoke with brutal clarity. It showed restraint where violence was alleged. It showed patience where provocation was constant. It showed a line held, not crossed. This mattered, not because it made Maya blameless, but because it made the narrative honest. In communities fractured by mistrust, honesty is currency, rare, hard-earned, and easily squandered. At a community meeting weeks later, the incident surfaced again, not as a spectacle, but as a case study. Residents spoke cautiously at first, then with growing openness. Questions were asked, fears were named, frustrations aired. Maya attended, not in uniform, but as herself. She listened more than she spoke. When it was her turn, she did not offer platitudes. "I can't promise you'll never see hate again," she said, "but I can promise that when it turns into harm, we have a responsibility to act. And we have a responsibility to do so without becoming the thing we're trying to stop." A woman in the audience wiped her eyes. A man nodded slowly. No one applauded. The moment didn't ask for it. What it asked for was trust, tentative, fragile, but present. The line between order and oppression is thin, and it must be walked with care, enforced with restraint, examined constantly. The answer to racism cannot be brutality. The answer to hate cannot be more hate. The answer must be accountability shaped by humanity. This is the long road forward. It does not end with an arrest or a sentence. It continues in training rooms and living rooms, in the choices people make when they witness harm, in the willingness to hold one another, not just offenders, but institutions, to standards that honor dignity. For Emily, the lesson crystallized into something simple but enduring. Silence protects the status quo. Speaking disrupts it. For Maya, it reaffirmed a truth she carried into every shift. Authority is not power unless it is guided by restraint. For the community, it offered a glimpse of what it looks like when lines are drawn clearly and held collectively, not with vengeance, but with resolve. America is not strengthened by pretending these moments do not happen. It is strengthened by facing them fully, responding justly, and refusing to let pain calcify into cynicism. The line held that day, not because one person was perfect, but because many people chose responsibility over retreat. And in that choice lies the quiet, stubborn hope that the road forward, though long, is still worth walking together. The ending we choose. Every story moves toward an ending, but not every ending is given. Some are chosen. Weeks passed. The supermarket returned to its ordinary rhythms, the quiet choreography of carts and conversations, the steady beeping of scanners, the small rituals of daily life that make a community recognizable to itself. On the surface, nothing marked the place where the incident had unfolded. There were no plaques, no scars in the tile, and yet something invisible had taken root. Emily noticed it first in herself, the way she stood a little straighter when a customer raised their voice, the way she listened more carefully when someone spoke from pain rather than anger. She had not become fearless. Fear still arrived, unannounced, but it no longer dictated her silence. One afternoon, a new hire froze when a customer began to berate her over a delayed prescription. Emily stepped in without thinking, her voice calm, her presence steady. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't escalate. It ended with the customer huffing and leaving. Afterward, the new hire whispered, "Thank you." Emily smiled. "Anytime." This was how change traveled, quietly, person to person, in moments that would never trend or go viral. It moved through habits and choices, not declarations. For Officer Maya Johnson, the weeks brought something unexpected, relief braided with resolve. The case moved through the system as it should, without spectacle, without shortcuts. Accountability did not erase the harm, but it affirmed something essential, that dignity mattered enough to defend, even when doing so required restraint under fire. On her days off, Maya volunteered at a youth mentorship program. She had nearly given up when the job grew heavy. She sat in a circle of teenagers who asked hard questions with unfiltered honesty. "Why do people hate?" one asked. Maya didn't rush the answer. "Sometimes," she said, "because they're afraid. Sometimes because they were taught the wrong things. And sometimes because they don't know how to sit with their own pain." "So what do we do?" another asked. "We learn," Maya said. "We help each other. And when we have power, any kind of power, we use it to protect, not to harm." The teens nodded, some skeptical, some hopeful, all listening. The older man with the cane returned to the store one evening, not because he needed anything, but because he wanted to. He stood near the pharmacy for a moment, watching people move through the space with unremarkable ease. He felt a small, surprising swell of pride, not in an institution, but in a moment of collective backbone. Later, he wrote a letter to the local paper. It wasn't accusatory or grand. It simply thanked the employees and officers for refusing to normalize cruelty. "We do not become better by pretending hate is harmless," he wrote. "We become better by standing together when it appears." The letter ran on page 3. Some readers skimmed it, some clipped it out. A few argued in the comments, and a few, quietly, took it to heart. The child from the store grew curious in new ways. He asked more questions at school. He noticed who was left out on the playground and why. When a classmate repeated something unkind they'd heard at home, he paused, then said, "That's not okay." It wasn't a lecture. It was a boundary. His teacher noticed. She smiled. Pain does not vanish because we wish it gone. It fades when it is met with truth, accountability, and care. The incident at the store had been painful precisely because it revealed something real, how easily cruelty can spill into shared spaces, how quickly dignity can be threatened. But it also revealed something else. It showed what happens when people refuse to look away, when the law is applied without malice, when authority is exercised without humiliation, when bystanders decide that silence is not neutrality, but permission, and withdraw that permission. The lesson is not that one arrest fixed a nation's wounds. That would be a comforting lie. The lesson is smaller and therefore more demanding. Each moment asks us who we will be. America is not an abstract idea. It is a series of choices made in ordinary places: a checkout line, a patrol car, a kitchen table, a classroom. Each choice tilts the balance toward fear or toward care, toward division or toward belonging. Racism survives when people believe they are alone. It withers when communities prove otherwise. Love is not sentimental here. It is practical. It sounds like stepping in. It looks like a restraint. It feels like courage that arrives trembling and stays anyway. At the end of the story, there is no triumphant music swelling over a vanquished villain. There is something better, a quieter confidence that cruelty did not win the day, that dignity held, that the line was drawn and kept, not to punish for punishment's sake, but to protect the shared promise of public life. When the lights dim and the video ends, what remains is not outrage, but resolve, not despair, but a steadier hope, the kind that knows progress is imperfect and insists on it anyway. This is the ending we choose, not once but repeatedly, to refuse discrimination in word and deed, to love beyond comfort, to help when it costs us ease, to build a stronger America not by denying our pain, but by transforming it, together, into something that looks like care, sounds like fairness, and feels like home. And when the next ordinary day arrives, as it always does, we carry this ending with us. Not as a conclusion, but as a beginning we are proud to continue. What we carry forward. This story reminds us that America is not defined by our worst moments, but by how we answer them. When we choose empathy over indifference, courage over silence, and accountability over excuses, we turn pain into purpose. We learn that love is not passive. It shows up, it listens, it protects. And when we help one another across differences, we don't erase our histories. We honor them by building something better together. A stronger America is made in everyday choices: to stand up for dignity, to refuse discrimination, to extend a hand where harm once lived. It's built when we see one another fully and decide that everyone belongs. If this story moved you, if it challenged you, if it reminded you of who we can be, subscribe to the Racist Reality channel and visit the channel to watch more videos. Join a community committed to truth, humanity, and hope. Together, let's keep choosing love, keep choosing justice, and keep building an America we're proud to share.